Yud Beis Amud Aleph, everybody. Strap on your seatbelts and let's get going. The Mishnah says, Hamakdish nechasav. A person sanctifies his estate. In other words, he takes his whole estate and sanctifies it for the temple. We saw this exact quote yesterday. The Gemara had quoted this Mishnah yesterday. If within the estate there is livestock that can be used as karbanos, correction, I'm getting mixed up. If there's something in the estate, a commodity that can be used for communal karbanos, so Yinasnu le'umim discharin divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, give that item to the artisans for their work. Now, we had seen this yesterday, and we had clarified that the only commodity that can only be used for communal karbanos and not for individual karbanos is what? Is ketoris. That's the only item that the Mishnah can possibly be discussing, and that will be clarified by the Gemara today. So if a person sanctifies his property, and within that property is ketoris, then that ketoris can be just given to the artisans as their compensation, and then we'll take the new shekels of the new year and we'll buy it back from these artisans and we'll use that ketoris for the temple. So we learned about this exchange, this barter that's taking place. We learned about it yesterday. The only thing that is different from yesterday is that Rabbi Akiva argues with what we learned yesterday. We learned yesterday that if a person, if there's ketoris left over from the previous year, then what you have to do is you have to first desanctify the ketoris before you give it to the artisans. And once you've desanctified it, they can take it as their compensation, and then you re-sanctify it by giving them cash from the Trumas Halishka of the new year, and the ketoris is re-sanctified because the shkalim's kedusha is switched with the desanctified ketoris, and so the money becomes desanctified and the ketoris becomes re-sanctified. But over here we're saying that you don't have to desanctify the ketoris. According to Rabbi Akiva, you can give them sanctified ketoris, and the ketoris will become desanctified by switching onto their intangible work product. Rabbi Akiva has a unique shita that says that even if there's not a physical, tangible item that the holy item can switch onto, can be mischalel onto, even if there's an intangible, let's say I'm a lawyer and I provide legal advice, that's intangible work product. If I'm a doctor and I provide medical advice and I provide a regimen of exercise to my patient, that's intangible work product, and therefore that too can be used as something to transfer kedusha from a holy item onto that intangible work product. When an artisan builds something, his intangible work product is the finished product outside of the building materials, and you can therefore transfer the kedusha of the ketoris onto that intangible work product, and that's how the ketoris becomes chulin, and then you purchase the desanctified ketoris back from the artisans.
What's the other way of desanctifying it that doesn't include that? What was the other way?
It goes on to coinage.
You just say it.
Oh, it goes on to
no, it has to transfer onto something tangible according to what we learned yesterday. The only difference between yesterday and today is that yesterday you have to transfer it onto coins, and Rabbi Akiva says you can transfer it onto an intangible work product. Period.
So get the ketoris?
They get the ketoris, but for the purpose of us buying it back from them
right,
with the new shkalim, like we learned yesterday. So this is a continuation of yesterday's discussion. The purpose of giving them the ketoris is to transfer it back to the Beis HaMikdash using the new shkalim. And like we said, we need to do this in order that it can come out of Beis HaMikdash's property first, and then come back into their possession using the new shkalim. That's the whole objective of this exercise. Weiter. Now we go to Ben Azai. Ben Azai is what our previous Mishnah was holding like yesterday. Amar lo Ben Azai, Eina hi hamida. That's not the way to do it, because Ben Azai says you can't transfer the kedusha onto intangibles. It can only be transferred onto concrete, discrete items. And therefore, Ela mafrishin mehen schar ha'umnin. But what you rather do is you take coins from the old Truma Salishka, and you transfer the Kedusha of the Ketores onto those coins, Umechalin Osan Almosa Umnin, right? That's the money is the coins are the compensation for the Umnin. You desanctify the Ketores onto those coins, Vinos and Osan Umnin Bischaran, and then you give the Ketores to the Umnin as their compensation. V'chos and Velochin Osa Mitruma Chadasha. And then, as we learned yesterday, you purchase the Ketores from the Umnin using the Nushkalim. Fine. Next. Hamakdish Nechasa V'haya Behen Behema Ru'ya Al Gabi Mizbeach Zachar Munekevos. A person sanctifies his estate, and within his estate is livestock. This livestock can be used as karbanos, so there are both male and female animals within his estate. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer Zacharim Yimachru L'Tzarchei Olos Unekevos Yimachru L'Tzarchei Zivchei Shlamim Udemeim Yiplu Im Shar Nechasav L'Berek Habayis. So Rabbi Eliezer has the following shita. Rabbi Eliezer says, we assume that when a person sanctifies his estate, he means that the sanctification should be for the Berek Habayis. Berek Habayis means for the treasury of the temple that is designated for the upkeep of the temple. It is used in contradistinction to Kodshe Mizbeach. So let's be very clear. There's Kodshe Berek Habayis and there's Kodshe Mizbeach. Even though these animals are usable for the Mizbeach, but when a person made his sanctification declaration, it was for the Berek Habayis. So these animals only have Kedushas Berek Habayis, they do not have Kedushas Mizbeach. And yet, says Rabbi Eliezer, since they are usable for Karbanos, the proper protocol is to sell them to other people who need these animals as Karbanos. The animal becomes thereby desanctified from its Kedushas Berek Habayis, and that Kedusha is transferred onto the money that was paid for these animals. And then what you do is you take that money and you put it in the treasury of the Berek Habayis. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. Rabbi Yehoshua disagrees. What?
Isn't that different because it's transferring two kinds of Kedushas?
Well, the whole point is that the animal has Kedushas Berek Habayis.
Right,
so you desanctify from his Kedushas Berek Habayis by selling it. Right. The Kedusha transfers onto coins. The animal is now chulin. Tomorrow we'll speak this out. Well, yeah, it's chulin. It has to be chulin in order to be able to be used as a korban. A korban can't be from Kedushas Berek Habayis. It has to be chulin. The Gemara will speak this out momentarily. It's going to get even more confusing, so I just would ask, unless it's an issue of clarification, please suspend all questions, because otherwise you're just going to get more confused. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer, Zecharim Atzmim Yikarvu Olos, Unekevos Yimachru L'Sarchei Zivchei Shlamim, V'yavi B'Demeim Olos, Usha'ar Nechasim Yiplu L'Berek Habayis. Rabbi Yehoshua disagrees. Rabbi Yehoshua is of the opinion that when a person makes a declaration of Hektish, and within that estate that he's being Makdish, is livestock, then he really does mean for the livestock to attain Kedushas Mizbeach and not just Kedushas Berek Habayis. And therefore, if there are male animals that are contained within this livestock, then the objective is for them to be the possession of the temple to offer as Nedavos Ola, as Ola sacrifices for the Kayetz HaMizbeach, for the downtime on the altar. If there are female animals, then you could argue, well, then just bring them as gift offerings of shlamim, because a female can be brought as a shlamim. But no, says Rabbi Yehoshua, you have to sell these animals as shlamim sacrifices to other people, take the proceeds and purchase male animals that you can bring as olos. Now, why would you say, why is that? So the Karban Ha'eda explains, because when a person is makdish as nechasim, he wants all of it to go to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? When you offer a shlamim animal, some of that animal goes to Kohanim. And that's not the person's objective. He doesn't want the animal to be eaten by human beings. He wants it all to be burned to Hashem. So therefore, Rabbi Yehoshua says that whatever can be brought as a korban, that's what the person's intention is when he sanctified it initially. Whatever is left, that is non-livestock, automatically goes to the Berek Habayis. Amar Rabbi Akiva, Roa ani astivra Rabbi Eliezer medivra Rabbi Yehoshua, Rabbi Eliezer Hishva Ismidosa, Rabbi Yehoshua Chalak. Rabbi Akiva argues that Rabbi Eliezer makes more sense to him than Rabbi Yehoshua, because Rabbi Eliezer is consistent, that whatever a person is makdish automatically goes to Berek Habayis. Rabbi Yehoshua says that no, that a person, when he says hektish, it means to divide in his mind between the livestock and the non-livestock, and that, says Rabbi Akiva, doesn't make so much sense to me that a person is having that presence of mind to be able to do that. Amar Rabbi Papias, Shamatias divrei shnehem. Rabbi Papias disagrees with Rabbi Akiva, and he says, both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua make sense to me. Under what circumstances? Hamakdish beferish kediver Rabbi Eliezer, behamakdish stam kediver Rabbi Yoshua. The way the Korban Ha'ida and the Takmin Chadatin understand this is as follows. If you sanctify explicitly, which means that you say, my non-livestock and my livestock shall be hektish. So by making that kind of declaration where you've distinguished and identified between your livestock and your non-livestock, what you mean is for both of them to be the same level of hektish, because you've singled them out individually. And therefore it makes more sense to say that in that situation, we would paskin like Rabbi Eliezer and say that both the livestock and the non-livestock are combined to be both for bedek habayis. But if you just say, stam, my whole estate is hektish, so then we say we divide it like Rabbi Yoshua, and whatever can be brought as a carbon has kedushas mizbeach, and whatever cannot be brought as a carbon has kedushas bedek habayis. Next, hamakdish nechasav v'hayu v'hen devarim re'uyim legabi mizbeach. Now, if a person sanctifies his assets, again, the same case, and within these assets are non-animal sacrificial items, meaning up until now we've been talking about where in your estate is livestock that can be brought as an animal carbon. What if within your estate is not livestock that can be brought as a carbon, but other commodities that can be used on the mizbeach, such as yenos, ushmonim, va'ofos, wine, oil, and birds. So Rabbi Eliezer Omer, now this, by the way, this is a different Rabbi Eliezer. This is Rabbi Elazar, according to the Bar Tanura. So it's a different Rabbi Eliezer from the first part, because as we'll see, this Tana holds like Rabbi Yehoshua, that whatever can be brought as a carbon has kedushas mizbeach. So Rabbi Elazar Omer, yimachru litzarchei oso hamin, that what you should do is sell that oil or that wine or whatever other libation or bird, sell it to whoever needs that commodity to bring their carbon. And then the proceeds go for purchasing olos, animal olos, for the kayetz hamizbeach, which is what a person's intention is when he sanctifies it for kedushas mizbeach. And then the rest of the non-sacrificial commodities goes to automatically the bedek habayis. Okay, that's just the Mishnah. Now let's take a look at the Gemara. So says the Gemara, Hamakdish v'chulei lekarbanos tzibor. A person sanctifies his ketores, something that can only be used for the karbanos tzibor. So Rabbi Yochanan Amar ketores. Rabbi Yochanan says straight up, the only thing that we can possibly only be used for karbanos tzibor, not karbanos yachid, is the ketores. That's what we're talking about. Now, Amar Rabbi Hoshia tiftar be'uman mishel beis avtinas shayanotel bischaro ketores. Now, this is a direct quote from the Gemara that we saw just an amud ago. And I'll tell you what the Gemara was talking about yesterday. The Gemara had asked the question, does the ketores need to be manufactured in a kli shares, or can it be manufactured in a chulin vessel and later sanctified? So we had a machlokes of the Amoraim as far as what the halacha is, and the Gemara wanted to try and prove the opinion that the ketores does not need to be manufactured in a kli shares. What's the proof? From our Mishnah. Because our Mishnah says that if a person, an individual private party, sanctifies his estate, and within that estate is manufactured ketores, it can be used eventually for the ketores in the Beis HaMikdash, using this process of transferring it to the umnin and then purchasing it back from the umnin. So what's the proof? This ketores was not manufactured in a kli shares, and you still see that it's kosher for use in the Beis HaMikdash. So that proves that the ketores does not have to be manufactured in a kli shares in order for it to be kosher for the temple. Rabbi Hoshia said it ain't necessarily so, because it's possible that our Mishnah also believes that it has to be manufactured in a kli shares. What's the case of where a person was makdish his estate? This person who's been makdish his estate is none other than a member of the family of Beis Avtinas. The family of Beis Avtinas were in charge of manufacturing the ketores. And what's their entitlement? They've manufactured the ketores and in a kli shares, that's their job. And then they are compensated for their work by getting the surplus ketores. Okay, that's what we learned yesterday. What do you do with the surplus ketores? You compensate people who were artisans for the temple with surplus ketores, and then we buy it back from them with the new shkalim. What would happen if this fellow from Beis Avtinos, before we had a chance to buy it back from him, was makdish the ketores? In that scenario, since he's gotten the ketores that he himself manufactured, so then part of his estate is the ketores that was manufactured in a kli shares. And therefore, that's why this ketores is usable for the temple. But it's altogether possible, learning it this way, that if a person were to manufacture ketores not in a kli shares, then it would not be usable for the temple. Okay, but that's exclusively according to Rabbi Hoshea. Now, ma taima de Ben Azai. What is Ben Azai's reason? Separate question. For arguing with Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says, give sanctified ketores to the umnin, to the artisans, and it will be desanctified by passing its kedusha onto the intangible work product. So she'ein ha'ekdesh mischalal al hamalacha ela al ha'maos. Ben Azai disagrees with that, and he says that you can only transfer kedusha from a commodity onto something tangible, onto cash. You can't transfer it onto an intangible work product. Next, Taman Taninan, Yesh Bekodshe Bedek Habayis. There's a Mishnah I think it's a Mishnah in Temura, if I'm not mistaken. The Mishnah states as follows: that that there are certain features of Kodshe Bedek Habayis, of things that are sanctified for the Bedek Habayis. What are the features? Number one, that when you make a vanilla declaration of hektish, that automatically goes to the Bedek Habayis. That's number one. And number two is hektish Bedek Habayis chalal hakol, that a declaration of hektish for Bedek Habayis works for all commodities. In other words, whereas I can only be makdish livestock for kedushas mizbeach, something that's usable for the altar, I can be makdish my couch for Bedek Habayis. So that declaration of hektish will work on anything that I own that's of value. Furthermore, when something only has hektish of Bedek Habayis, you nevertheless, it is such an object is subject to me'ilah, and even if the thing that has kedushas Bedek Habayis is an animal, let's say, that gives milk, or that has offspring, that milk and offspring is also subject to me'ilah, to being liable for using it for personal use. Another feature of Kodshe Bedek Habayis is that the Kohanim may not benefit from Kodshe Bedek Habayis. Kodshe Mizbeach, the Kohanim can benefit from. Even if it's brought as a korban ola, the Kohanim still get the hide of that korban. So that's another distinctive feature of Kodshe Bedek Habayis. But what's the point of quoting this Mishnah? Amar Rabbi Chananya de Rabbi Eliezer he the Taninan hamakdish nechasa v'hayisa b'hen behema ru'uya al gabi mizbeach zachar min hakavos Rabbi Eliezer Omer zachar yimachu l'tzorchei olos u'nekevos yimachu l'tzorchei zivchei shlamim demim yipulu m'shar nechasim l'bedek habayis. That Mishnah in Temura that we just cited, which says that when you make a declaration of hektish, there's an automatic assumption that it's meant for bedek habayis, goes according to Rabbi Eliezer of our Mishnah, who said that regardless of whether it's livestock or non-livestock, whenever you sanctify all of your assets, there's an assumption that everything that you've sanctified goes to the Bedek Habayis. That's consistent with the Mishnah in Temura that says that stam hektish, vanilla hektish, is automatically for Bedek Habayis. According to Rabbi Yehoshua, that would not be the case. If I go over to an animal or my entire estate and I say hektish, so then the animals would have kedushas kodshe, would be considered kodshe mizbeach, not kodshe Bedek Habayis, not like the Mishnah in Temura. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Time of the Rabbi Eliezer. What's Rabbi Eliezer's reasoning to argue that when you make something hektish, it's automatically assumed for the Bedek Habayis? It's based on the following psukim. It says in the Torah, "V'ish ki yakdishas beiso kodesh l'Hashem," that if a person shall sanctify his house as holy for God. Now that clearly that pasuk is talking about kodshe Bedek Habayis, because you can't sanctify a house for the altar. You can't bring a house on an altar. So therefore, the kedusha that is being discussed in this pasuk is kodshe Bedek Habayis, correct? So now the question is, Bama anon kayomin. what is the subject of that pasuk? It can't be a real house, because imba beis dira, if it's talking about a house where a person lives in, kevar ksiv imamakdish yigalas beso. There's another pasuk that addresses the halachos of what a person is supposed to do when he sanctifies his house. So when the Torah says that if you sanctify your house, it can't literally mean house, but rather what? Ela ki anan kayomin b'makdish nechasa. That really what the pasuk is talking about is not being makdish a house, but being makdish a household. Basically, the contents of a house, a person's assets. And from here we see, based on the verbiage of the pasuk, that the household has the same status as the house. Just like the house goes to Bedek Habayis, so too the household goes to Bedek Habayis. Mikan shestam ekdeshus lebedek habayis. Okay, Amar Rabbi Ze'era. Now we have a machlokes as far as how to understand our Mishnah. Rabbi Ze'era in the name of Rav Chuna b'shem Rav bameh pligin. What's the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua? B'makdish nechasav. When you take your entire estate, which is comprised of both livestock and non-livestock, that's where Rabbi Eliezer says everything is for bedek habayis. And Rabbi Yehoshua says the livestock is for mizbeach and the rest is for bedek habayis. Aval b'makdish edro kol amamodi shehula mizbeach. But if a person only sanctifies his livestock, then even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that we assume that it goes for the mizbeach. Okay, that's what Rabbi Ze'era says. Rabbi Ba, Rav Chuna b'shem Rav, Rabbi Ba says differently, together with these other rabbis. Ma pligin b'makdish edro. That no, the machlokus in our Mishnah is only when a person sanctifies just his livestock. And that's where Rabbi Eliezer says we assume he wants it for the bedek habayis, because he didn't state specifically that he wants it to be for the mizbeach. And Rabbi Yehoshua says no, we assume that it's going for a mizbeach. But if a person were to sanctify his entire estate, livestock and non-livestock together, kol amamodi shehula bedek habayis, then even Rabbi Yehoshua would agree that since part of the estate can only go to bedek habayis, then the livestock also would go to bedek habayis. Just the exact opposite of Rabbi Ze'era. So al daite de Rabbi Ze'era nicha. So Rabbi Ze'era works out. Rabbi Ze'era's opinion is that our Mishnah is only talking about there's only a machlokes when you're makdish an entire estate that is a combination of both livestock and non-livestock. That makes very good sense. Everything is cogent, everything is logical. Rabbi Eliezer holds everything is for bedek habayis. Rabbi Yehoshua says the livestock is for the mizbeach and the non-livestock is for the bedek habayis. All makes sense. But the kasha al Rabbi Ba. But the kasha is on Rabbi Ba's mahalach. Because Rabbi Ba says that even if a person is exclusively makdish livestock, according to Rabbi Eliezer, he means for it to go to the bedek habayis. The question is, how do you know that? Behema lola mizbeachi? Isn't a behema meant for the altar? And therefore, the way the Korban speaks out the question, since a person was ambiguous in his declaration, then why shouldn't I be machmir and give it the higher status of kedusha of kodshei mizbeach? Why should I assume that he means the lower level of kedusha of bedek habayis? That doesn't seem to make any sense. It's counterintuitive. So the Gemara says, you're right. Behema la mizbeachi. In truth, animals are meant for the altar. However, v'lama sasam ha'ish hazeh shehu ka'omer lo yihiyeh ela lebedek habayis. But then the question is, why was this person so ambiguous? He should have said that, and the way the Korban Ha'edah speaks out, that he says, he didn't say explicitly, these animals are hektish. He pointed to his flakin and says, these are hektish, or this property is hektish. And the fact that he said it in such a generic way indicates that he's not singling them out as animals. He's singling them out as property. And since stam property goes for bedek habayis, he means it to go for bedek habayis. That's what Rebbe Eliezer's approach.
He can't retract. That's the point of this, right? Once he said what he said, it's done.
Well, that goes without saying, right? You're saying you're asking, well, what did you mean? It's once he says it, it's too late,
That's it,
right?
Too late.
Right.
Why do you ask him?
No, that's the point.
Because even if they ask him, what comes out of your mouth is a formulation of a certain halachic reality, then you can't qualify your statement afterwards. So Rabbi Yochanan Omar lo shanya, hi hamakdish nechasav, hi hamakdish edro, hi hamachlokes. Now we have a third opinion, which is Rabbi Yochanan, and he says that the machlokas of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua is universal. It applies both when you're makdish an entire estate that is comprised both of livestock and non-livestock, and the machlokas is also when you're makdish exclusively livestock. In both cases, Rabbi Eliezer says that everything is for bedek habayis, and Rabbi Yehoshua says whatever is livestock and is usable for the altar is for the altar, and whatever is not usable for the altar is bedek habayis. And it makes no difference whether it was just a flock of sheep or whether it was a flock of sheep combined with other commodities as well. Now Rav Huna b'shem Rav, Rabbi Yavahu b'shem Rabbi Yochanan, Kache bedek habayis shepoda'an tamimin yetzu l'chulin. He says it's an independent statement, which is as follows. If a person sanctifies an animal with kedushas bedek habayis, let's say he says explicitly, this animal shall be for the bedek habayis, and then you want to redeem it. By redeeming it onto cash, you can, because kodshe bedek habayis have kedushas damim, not kedushas haguf, and therefore it's subject to redemption. What happens to the animal afterwards? The animal becomes completely chulin. Now, our Mishnah had said that if an animal has kodshe bedek habayis, you should sell it to someone who needs to bring it as a korban. Not because it has kedushas mizbeach, but rather because it's the proper thing to do. So once it comes into the temple's possession, don't get rid of it to have it for steak at your Sunday dinner. Use it for something holy as well. But not because it's committed to a korban, because it only has kedushas bedek habayis. Now, this is consistent, and that's what the Gemara is going to speak out. Masnis and Amrike. Our Mishnah supports that contention that once you redeem kodshe bedek habayis, even non-blemished livestock, the animal becomes completely chulin. So first, before we get to our Mishnah, let's go to a Mishnah in Chulin. The Mishnah in Chulin says, Vladan v'chelban mutter la'achar pidjona, because it says that the Gemara's question, the way that the Korban Eidah says it is that this is a question. Masnisin Amra Kain, does the Mishnah support this? Because the Mishnah says that only the milk and the offspring of such an animal can become chulin, which implies that the animal itself cannot become chulin if it was sanctified for bedek habayis. Answers the Gemara, Rav Chizkiya b'shem Rav Chizda, tipater shepida'an tamimin v'humimu. So when we say that the animal becomes completely chulin, we're talking about a situation where you redeem it, and you pass the animal's kedusha onto coinage, and that which we say it goes immediately l'chulin is if the animal then develops a blemish. In that situation, where the animal develops a blemish, and it can't be used anymore as a korban, then the only alternative is to use it for your steak dinner. That's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Now, Rabbi Yosef b'shem Rav Chizda masnisin amrakein. Our Mishnah supports Rabbi Yochanan's contention as well, that technically the animal is chulin even in its unblemished state, because it says Vladan v'chelban aser la'achar pidjona. Now this is another Mishnah. This Mishnah, I think, is also this Mishnah it's in Temura, and this Mishnah says it's talking about kodshe mizbeach, that animals who have kedushas mizbeach, then the offspring of these animals and their milk are going to be aser after they're redeemed. And the implication of this is that if something is not kodshe mizbeach, but rather kodshe bedek habayis, then they can be redeemed, and once they develop a mum, they can go to chulin. That seems to be the way the Korban Ha'edah learns it out. He's saying that the Mishnah only places this very large stigma of after redemption, the animals, even their offspring, are going to be aser, is only when it's kodshe mizbeach. But kodshe bedek habayis, the offspring goes for chulin, and the animal also becomes chulin, provided that it develops a mum. Rabbi Chizkiya b'shem Rabbi Yossi, kodshe bedek habayis shepeda'an tamimin yetzu l'chulin. So he says the same thing, that once you redeem them, even if they're tamimim, if they're unblemished, they technically become chulin, because in Tamar lo yetzu l'chulin heich kodshe mizbeach cholin al kodshe bedek habayis. So ba'alei mumin kodshe mizbeach chala aleihen. I'm sorry, al kodshe bedek habayis. Exclamation point. And this goes to Alan's point. Alan had asked previously, how is it that if an animal was sanctified with bedek habayis, I can now bring them as a carbon, which requires Kedushas Mizbeach. How does that transfer take place? The answer is that when a person sanctifies his livestock for Bedek Habayis, you transfer that Kedusha onto the coins that a person pays to use that animal, and that animal then becomes chulin. Then it's re-sanctified by the bringer of the carbon with Kedushas Mizbeach, and that's how it can be brought as a carbon. So basically, our Mishnah supports the contention that an animal that was redeemed with that an animal that was sanctified with Bedek Habayis, and then it is redeemed, that animal is Yotzei L'chulin. As our Mishnah had said, the preference is to sell it to someone, but were that animal to develop a blemish, like Rabbi Yochanan had said, then that animal could be considered to be completely chulin, and you could have it for dinner at your house. Now, the next thing that the Gemara says is Baalei Mumin Kodshe Mizbeach Chola Aleihen, that if a person takes an animal that is blemished and he declares it to have Kedushas Mizbeach, now this is a prohibition in the Torah. You're not allowed to designate a blemished animal as a korban. If you do so, you're in violation of a mitzvah in the Torah. However, post facto, b'di'evet, if you did it, the animal still attains Kedushas Mizbeach. And that's what the Gemara is telling us. Even though you did something wrong, but the animal still has the Kedusha of a korban. So the Gemara now asks, Liyei da milsa. What are the ramifications of that? I can't bring it as a korban, so what do I do with it? So the answer is, Lagiza v'la avoda. The answer is that don't think that it only has Kedushas Bedek Habayis. No, it has the higher level of Kedushas Mizbeach to the point where I'm not allowed to benefit from the shearings and the work of this animal. If it only had Kedushas Bedek Habayis, then then we could shear the animal and benefit from its shearings. But no, we can't benefit from this animal at all because it has a higher level of Kedusha. Now, Hifrish Nekeva La'olasa Ulapischa Ula'ashamo. Now we have another case, which is going to be a big discussion here in the Gemara. A person sets aside a female animal, and he designates that female animal that he's going to bring this animal as a korban ola, or as a korban pesach, or as a korban asha. Now what he's done is nonsensical, because these three korbanos can only be brought from male animals, and he instead designated a female as his korban. So osa temura, even though this animal cannot be brought as that korban, it still attains the kedushas haguf of kodshe mizbeach, and therefore the law of temura applies to that animal. Remember what the law of temura is, where I take animal A, which has kedushas mizbeach, and then I take animal B, which is chulin, and I say animal B shall be instead of animal A. So the Torah says that in that situation, both animal A and animal B now have kedushas mizbeach and are both subject to temura, to me'ila. Okay, so now, even though this female animal is not usable as a korban, it still attains kedushas mizbeach in order to create temura.
You're not allowed to do that, right?
Well, you're not supposed to do that. I don't know if it's the same lab as a balmum, right? But I don't know if it's the same isser as a balmum. But the bottom line is that it can't be used as a korban. Rabbi Shimon Omer la'olaso osa temuro lepischo ulashamo ena osa temura. Rabbi Shimon says that no, it depends. If you designated the female as an ola sacrifice, then it has kedushas mizbeach and therefore can create temura. But if you designated it as an asham or a pesach, since those animals cannot at all be brought as a male, we'll see in ola there is a female association to an ola sometimes, and therefore the ola can attain kedushas haguf to make temura, but the korban pesach and the korban asham, which are designations for a female, that animal does not attain kedushas haguf and therefore does not make temura. And the Gemara will explain why in just a minute. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Shimon. Now we have a third opinion, which is Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Shimon, and he says la'olaso ulapischo ulashamo ena osa temura. For none of the three animals, for none of the three designations, I should say, does a female animal attain kedushas haguf. Now let's explain the basis of this three-way machlokes. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Taima de Reb Shimon, Shekein motzinu nekeva ba'ov kishera lavo ola. So let's examine the second opinion, which is the opinion of Reb Shimon. He says that only when the nekeva, the female, is designated as an ola, does it attain kedushas haguf, but not if it's designated as an asham or a pesach. What's the difference? The answer is that even though an animal may not be a female in order to be brought as an ola, but a bird is different. If I designate a female bird as an ola, a female bird can be brought as an ola. So there's some level of association between femaleness and olaness, even though it's a totally different creature. But nevertheless, that's enough of an association to make this animal attain kedushas haguf. Whereas a pesach and an asham can never be female. There's no femaleness associated at all with a korban pesach and a korban asham. Ba'amar Reb Yochanan, Taimad Reb Shimon ben Yehuda, im min b'minohu chalak alav, kol shekain min b'she'eno mino. And now the reasoning of the third opinion, which says that kedushas haguf never adheres to a female, regardless of whether it's an ola, an asham, or a pesach, his argument is as follows. If I take the correct gender and species of an animal, but it's just the wrong age, then the kedusha does not adhere to that animal. Then certainly if I take the wrong gender, then the kedusha should not adhere to that animal. So ezuhu min b'mino, what do you mean if it's the same type? Shehu chaluk alav kahada detani, where you see the following brisa that clarifies this, because it says asham ben shana vehevi ben shtayim vehevi ben shalosh lo yatsa. That if a person tries to bring a korban asham and tries to designate an animal that is the asham that I have to bring, let's say according to the Torah, has to be a year-old, and I bring a 2-year-old animal, I designate a 2-year-old animal, or my asham has to be a 2-year-old animal and I bring a 3-year-old animal. In both of those cases, the kedusha does not adhere at all to that korban asham. So if that's the case, that if it's the wrong age, the kedusha does not adhere to it. So surely, if it's the wrong gender, the kedusha should not adhere to it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Reb Shimon v'Rabbi Yoshua Shneim Amru Davar Echad. That Rabbi Shimon, this is the third Reb Shimon, I should say, which is Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Reb Shimon, who says that the kedusha never adheres to a nekeva. He is consistent with Rabbi Yehoshua. What is that? Kamad Rabbi Yehoshua Omar nekeva la'ola lo kidsha ela hektish damim. That Rabbi Yehoshua was quoted as saying that if a man designates a female animal as having kedushas ola, the kedusha of an ola sacrifice, it only has kedushas damim. It doesn't have any inherent kedushas haguf as a korban ola, and therefore cannot make tamura, like Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda had said. Kain Reb Shimon Amar nekeva la'ola lo kidsha ela hektish damim. And similarly, that's exactly what our Reb Shimon is saying, the third opinion of this three-way machlokes, that regardless of whether it's an ola or an asham or a pesach, there's no kedushas haguf that can adhere to this animal that's in a keva. So in Tamar kedusha kadsha kedushas haguf yiru, and because if you were going to say that it has kedushas haguf, we would require this animal to have to graze and develop a mum before we could use it, and we don't require that because it only has kedushas damim. It doesn't have kedushas haguf, and therefore you can just go ahead and redeem the animal's kedusha onto coinage. Omer Rabbi ani roes divrei Reb Shimon b'Pesach. So comes along, and by the way, the korban ha'ida changes the girsa, and he says as follows: Ein ani roes divrei Reb Shimon b'Pesach. I disagree with Reb Shimon when it comes to the korban Pesach. Reb Shimon says that if you designate a nekeva as a korban Pesach, the kedusha does not. There's no kedushas haguf that adheres in the animal. He says I disagree with Reb Shimon when it comes to the korban Pesach. I hold that if you take a nekeva and designate it as a korban Pesach, then the kedushas haguf can adhere to that animal. How is that? Mosar Pesach bashlamim. The answer is because what do you do with a lamb that was designated as a korban Pesach and you have it left over from Pesach? You bring that as a korban shlamim. A korban shlamim can be brought from a female animal. So therefore, there is an association between the korban Pesach and femaleness, because this lamb would be converted into a shlamim if it's not brought on Pesach. So therefore, Rabbi says, I hold that if you designate this female animal as a Korban Pesach, then it does attain Kedushas Haguf and can create Tamura. So now the Gemara says, V'leima enani roa divrei Reb Shimon ba'asham, shahamoser asham ba'ola. So now the question is, by that token, you should say that you also disagree with Reb Shimon when it comes to designating an akeva as an asham. Because what happens if a person designates an animal as a korban asham and then he dies? What are you supposed to do with that leftover animal? You're supposed to bring it as a korban ola. And as we said, according to one opinion, there is femaleness associated with the korban ola, because a korban ola that's a bird can be a female. So therefore, why don't you say that there's femaleness associated with an asham as well, because it could be converted into an ola, and therefore the kedushas haguf should adhere to this animal as well. So Amar Rabbi Abin im hikdish pesach ba shlamim gufo karev shlamim im hikdish asham ba ola and gufo karev ola. The answer is very simple, says the Gemara. If you have an animal that was designated as a korban pesach and it's left over, that self-same animal is brought as a shlamim. So it's a much closer association to femaleness. However, if you have an animal that was designated as an asham and the owner died, you can't now bring that same animal as an ola. You have to let that animal graze until it develops a mum, sell it, and with the proceeds of that money, purchase a korban ola. So the association between Asham and Ola is much weaker than the association between Pesach and Shlamim. And that's why there is a greater connection between femaleness and the Korban Pesach versus femaleness to the Korban Asham. No, Mahu Kedon. So now the Gemara's question is, what is the machlokes between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon as far as... Now remember, the Tanakama had said that in all cases where I designate the animal, the female animal, whether it's an Ola, a Pesach, or an Asham, the animal does attain Kedushas Haguf. Now what's the machlokas between the Tanakama and Reb Shimon? So Amar, Hahein Amar Hektish Damim Hikdish, the Hahein Amar Hektish Gufo Hikdish. The machlokas is, what if I sanctify an animal, even though I'm only sanctifying it with kedushas damim, with a monetary kedusha that doesn't adhere to the innateness of the animal? According to the Tanakama, since this is an animal that can be, in theory, sacrificial, there is a migu. We say like a migu, that since it already is becoming hektish with kedushas damim, we cause that kedusha to inflate into kedushas haguf. And therefore, even though this animal cannot be brought itself as an ola because it's female, but it has kedushas haguf nonetheless, it's sort of its kedushas damim conflates into kedushas haguf, and therefore it is subject to creating tumura. However, both Reb Shimons disagree, and they say, no, since this animal only has been sanctified with kedushas damim, with monetary kedusha, it is no longer that kedushas damim does not conflate into or transfer into or mutate into kedushas haguf, and therefore it retains its kedushas damim status and does not create timura. We have to go weiter, and we're going to finish the DAF today. Rabbi Ze'era b'shem Reb Shimon ben Lakish, Taima de Rabbi Yehoshua. Now, previously on the previous Amud, we analyzed the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer. We said that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the reason why he holds that there's an automatic assumption that whatever you sanctify as berek habayis was based on the pasuk talking about the house, which really meant household. Now the question is, why does Rabbi Yehoshua say that anytime you have livestock, there's an automatic assumption that it's going for kedushas mizbeach? It's based on this pasuk: Daber al Aharon ve'el banav ve'el kol bnei Yisrael ve'omarta alehem. The Torah says, speak to Aaron, his sons, and to all of Bnei Israel, and say to them, Ish mi beis Yisrael, if any man from the house of Israel shall sanctify an animal, asher yakriv l'Hashem la'olah, that he shall offer to God as an olah offering. So what you see from this pasuk, hakol karev la'olah, that anything that you sanctify that has the potential to be an olah is automatically designated as an olah when you make a declaration of hektish upon it. Then the pasuk now continues and it says, L'rtzonachem tamim zachar, that it shall be according to your will if the animal is unblemished and it is male. So that pasuk seems to limit the only time that an animal is assumed to have kadshe mizbeach is only if it's unblemished and it's male. But minayin afilu nekevos, but that's not what Rabbi Yehoshua said. Rabbi Yehoshua said that even if the animal is female, it's also assumed to have kadshe mizbeach. So how do we know that? Talmud Lomar babakar. The pasuk later says cattle. Bakar, cattle, generically means both male and female. The Rabbos es nekevos, to include females. Rabbi Yitzchak be Rabbi Eliezer sha'al. So Rabbi Yitzchak, but when he was by Rabbi Elazar, he asked the following question: Kesiv zachar ve'at amart babakar l'Rabbos es nekevos? Question mark. I don't understand. The pasuk explicitly says males. And yet you're saying because it later says bakar, it means both male and female? That's counterintuitive. That doesn't make any sense. If the pasuk explicitly says males, it means to delimit the halacha just to males, that only males that you sanctify stam have kedushas mizbeach, right? So then he continues the line of questioning. He says, "Ude kavasik siv tamim be'at amart babakar l'Rabbos bali mumin?" Question mark. He says, by the same token, the Torah says that the animal has to be tamim in order for it to attain kedushas mizbeach. Tamim means unblemished. But then it says babakar, then it says cattle, which could be inclusive of all cattle, whether blemished or unblemished. Will you then argue that just like when you sanctify a blemished animal, it will automatically have kadshe mizbeach, even though it can't be brought as a carbon at all? Is that what you're going to argue as well because of the word bakar? So the Gemara says, "My beinan." What's the difference between the two? Rav Amar shifta dekat kada beineon. So I'm going to learn like the Taklin Chadatin commentary over here. Rav explains it is as clear as day, just as the stick of the weaver is clearly visible. Now, basically what Rav is answering is the answer or the distinction between a nekeva that's sanctified versus a balmum that's sanctified should be as clear as day. And therefore he doesn't even bother to clarify. So the Taklin Chadatin explains as follows. When the Torah writes the word zachar to mean male, and then it says afterwards bakar to include both males and females, that's legitimate, because the word bakar generically means males and females. So the word bakar is overriding the word zachar. And therefore any animal, whether it's male or female, that I sanctify is automatically assumed to have the kedusha of kadshe mizbeach. However, the word bakar is not inclusive, that term bakar is not used in the Levitical sense to include blemished animals. Because whenever the Torah is talking about bakar that is used for sacrificial purposes, it's talking about unblemished animals. So contextually, the word bakar never means to address blemished animals. And therefore, Rav says the distinction is clear as day. Bakar is coming to include females, but bakar is not coming to include blemished animals. Let us go weiter. Rabbi Elazar Omer Yimachru Chulei Hamim. The last part of our Mishnah was addressing the sheet of Rabbi Elazar. He goes like Rabbi Yehoshua, and he says that when a person sanctifies his estate, and within the estate there are items that are used for the mizbeach, but they are not themselves animals, then you can't use these libation ingredients directly for the kayetz hamizbeach, directly for the downtime on the altar, but rather you have to sell them and use the proceeds to purchase olos, which will use for the kayetz hamizbeach. So Rabbi Avahu b'shem Rav Shimon ben Lakish, time of the Rabbi Eliezer. The reason for Rabbi Eliezer is as follows: Daber al Aaron ve'elbana of the goimer asher yakrivu l'Hashem le'olah. That when the Torah talks about a person sanctifying animals for the kayetz hamizbeach, for the temple to bring as gift offerings on the altar on behalf of the community, it says that they have to be able to be brought as an olah. So yachol afilu ofos. You might think that birds are included, such that if a person were to sanctify birds for the mizbeach, then those can be directly brought by the temple as a korban. So tamulomar ba bakar velo ofos. That's why the pasuk says bakar. Based on the pasuk, only when a person sanctifies bakar, livestock that is not birds, can that animal be brought directly as a gift offering belonging to the temple for the kayetz hamizbeach. Rabbi Yirmi of a Rabbi Bon Barchia havun yasivin va'amrin taman amar Rabbi Yochanan. So they were sitting down together and they were going over this material, and they said to themselves that there's something here that doesn't make sense. Amar Rabbi Yochanan tamad Rabbi Shimon shekei nekeva shabaov kisher lava ola. Previously, Rabbi Yochanan had created a very strong connection between birds and animals. And he had said that the reason why when you sanctify a nekeva for an ola, that it has kedusha saguf, is because of the association between bird olas and animal olas. that since a bird can be a nekeva, it can be a female, so there's a female association to the ola, and that's why this female animal can attain kedushas haguf. So clearly Rabbi Yochanan feels that you can create this association between birds and animals. But v'hacha amar, hachin, but over here he says this. Here he says that there's a clear dividing line between birds and animals, such that if you sanctify a bird, it cannot be brought directly as a carbon for the kayetz hamizbeach. That seems to be counterintuitive. So the Gemara says, in other words, Rabbi Yochanan assumingly is contradicting himself. Rabbi Yochanan previously creates the strong association between birds and animals, and here he's disassociating them to the point where if you sanctify birds, they cannot be brought directly. They have to be sold first and use the proceeds to purchase olas. So how do you resolve that? So Amar Reb Yossi, ki amtia keha, I explain it as follows. The Amar Reb Shmuel b'shem Rebbe Ze'era, kol she'ena yachol likarib lo hiva lo dameha, lo katsha ela hektish damim. So he says that if you have an animal that it itself cannot be brought as a carbon, nor are you allowed to redeem it in the event that it develops a mum? So, in that situation, when you sanctify such an animal or such a creature, it only attains kedushas damim, and it does not attain kedushas haguf, because otherwise you're getting yourself into a catch-22 situation. Ve'ata martieyos lahakriva, and if you're going to say, in other words, and it's therefore proper to say that is it proper to say that it's okay to bring this animal? So therefore, in other words, it's not proper to say to bring it as a carbon. In at yachol you can't bring it as a carbon. Dichsiv babakar velo ofos. That's why we have to exclude birds from being sanctified from kachi hamizbeach. Because why? Because lifdoso in at yachol she'en la'of pidyon. A bird cannot be redeemed. Once a person sanctifies a bird as kache mizbeach, then that bird is just waiting for it to develop a mum. A bird can't be redeemed through development of a mum, because a bird is still kosher for the mizbeach even when it has a mum. And lafum kain sarach meimar lo kache ela kedushas damim. And therefore, the Torah explicitly precludes a bird from being offered as kache mizbeach, because there's no other option. The bird itself, that's why the Torah excludes it. It doesn't want you to bring a bird. It doesn't want you to, when you sanctify a bird, the bird only has kedushas damim, which is synonymous with kedushas berek habayis. It doesn't have kedushas haguf. Why? Because if it had kedushas haguf, then you would not be able to offer it, because the Torah explicitly precludes it from being offered. So therefore, when a person is makdish a bird, don't think that it automatically attains kedushas haguf to the point where it can't be sold. It can be sold. It can be redeemed onto cash, and therefore it's perfectly fine. Therefore, we're trying to explain why Rabbi Yochanan creates this disassociation between the animals and birds over here, even though he had previously created an association between animals and birds in our previous case. It's very confusing. We'll hold it here for today.